Hello guys, welcome back to another video from the debate hotline. I'm Flynn Williams, and today I'm going to be doing a topic analysis on the LD 2025 November-December topic about rewilding. So first, let's look at the topic wording. It says, resolved, the United States ought to rewild substantial tracts of land. When it comes to defining the United States, most people are going to see this as the federal government, and since the topic only specifies an actor, it's also questionable as to the extent to what land the United States can rewild in this topic, because you can argue that the United States can rewild land in other places so long as it is the actor. Additionally, you can view the United States as land, so tracts of land in the United States should be rewilded, as well as state governments being the actors because they are part of the United States. That's even more questionable and can probably get you into some definition heavy T debates. Then when the topic talks about ought to, this is commonplace within LD topics. It's probably referring to a moral obligation as well as policy action. Phil debaters would probably define it as the former, and then plan debaters and probably everyone else would define it as a policy action. Now, when we talk about rewilding, this is kind of where the topic kind of really begins. So Google says the process of restoring an area of land to its natural uncultivated state is what rewilding is. And this definition really doesn't encompass the multiple different forms of rewilding, so we're going to go over 5 of them right here. So first is Pleistocene and Holocene rewilding. They involve the reintroduction of large carnivores and herbivores respectively, and they both aim to kind of reboot ecosystems by affecting the food web, i.e. by changing the natural predators, by changing who is in the food web itself. Additionally, there's trophic rewilding, which attempts to restore natural trophic conditions, which are kind of feeding conditions and interactions within ecosystems. So this looks like the reintroduction of certain grass species, shrubs, herbs, etc., that that kind of animals on the lower end of the food web would be eating. Then there's kind of Anthropocene rewilding, and that's kind of rewilding that accepts human interaction as inevitable and needed. And so along with rewilding efforts, you are maintaining human presence on the land, which is questionably topical, but there's definitely literature that says rewilding can be done in this way. Next, there's passive rewilding, which is probably the most common, or is at least what is thought to be what rewilding is when you first think of it. And it's kind of just letting nature go with no interference or human intervention whatsoever. Then we get into the most kind of ambiguous part of the topic, which is substantial in tracts of land. So substantial, it's intuitive that it means big, but we don't know how big is big. So it's important to come up with some good definitions that possibly include both substantial and tracts of land in order to justify the plan or the aff that you want to read in order to say that it is substantial. So going along with that, tracts of land is just a piece of land, and it's being paired with substantial probably means that the United States rewild many different tracts of land and large tracts of land. So here is the aff breakdown of certain arguments. I'm going to be going over a wide array of arguments from policy to K to philosophy, and then you guys can choose which arguments you like best on this topic. So starting off with the policy, I think that main arguments on this topic are going to be related to climate change. And so there's many warrants as to why rewilding would benefit climate change. So first is that it increases biodiversity through the reintroduction of new species. It restores ecosystem functions and food webs, which is all the Pleistocene, Holocene, passive rewilding stuff that we talked about above, as well as ecological resilience is restored because you restore balance through the reintroduction of keystone species, as well as rewilding stops wildfires because they create natural fire-resistant landscapes and natural fire breaks that are otherwise not there because of things like logging industry. So those all can mitigate climate change and are probably independent advantages that you can read in the policy aff, but then also you can have advantages that stem from those, i.e. mitigating climate change, to say For example, a permafrost advantage that talks about how stopping climate change is key to stop permafrost thawing, because permafrost thawing can release pathogens from the ice that will cause human extinction, as well as a carbon cycling advantage that talks about stopping climate change as a way to regulate our carbon cycle so that we don't die. Now, onto the case side of things, I thought of 3 different apps that I think would probably best fit the critical lens of this topic, but I think that there are other arguments that pertain to things like anti-blackness that I also think could be viable. So the first argument was kind of a settler colonialism app that talks about how indigenous people want rewilding, and it fights against environmental racism, which can lead to things like decall, etc. And then there's kind of an anthropocentrism app that talks about how rewilding respects animals and fights anthropocentrism, which is bad. I think that the main thing that you would have to watch out for in this app is kind of turns to anthropocentrism or like philosophically dense positions that kind of favor humanism that you'd have to kind of respond to. So I also think that it's probably strategic to read Anthro as kind of a Phil K setup. And then there's a cap and degrowth app that talks about why rewilding fights growth and capitalism via degrowth, because you take down structures of production and kind of let nature do its thing rather than focus on exploiting it. You can also talk about why this would do things like solve climate change, etc. And it would interact well with lots of dissents and counterplans, but you'd have to be prepared to have the cap good v bad debate, as well as arguments about why taking down structures of production is bad and would cause extinction, like the agriculture just had. So then when it comes to fill arguments on the F, I think that there are 3 main fill arguments that I could come up with. So first is the Rawls and his famous future gens arguments. So we have like a moral duty to respect nature so that future generations can access it, appreciate it, etc. Because if we just destroy nature, then future generations don't have the ability to kind of appreciate nature for what it is or have the ability to talk about nature. So then there's Kant. There's modern Kant philosophers who argue that we have a duty to respect nature as an end, and rewilding does that. I think that you'd have to be careful with the syllogism, because there is also lots of evidence that says animals aren't practical reasoners, so you'd probably have to have a different internal link to the categorical imperative, or kind of a different syllogism overall that still kind of talks about Kantian ideals. And then there's a third F that is kind of Heidegger and authentic freedom. It talks about how rewilding lets nature be and have authentic freedom, absent human control and exploitation. I think that you just have to have civic evidence that says we have a moral duty to let nature have authentic freedom, because most literature just talks about humans and they're like that we have a moral duty to humans to have authentic freedom. So then moving into the negative arguments, there's going to be also a litany of arguments that we're going to cover here. So K's, decide, counterplans, and fill NCs. We're going to talk through them here. So first is critiques. I think that there's an abundance of critiques that can be read on this topic. First is a set call K. I think that there's many links depending on the AF that you are negating, but there's definitely a settler saviorism argument where kind of settlers are trying to save the environment in order to be seen as legitimate colonizers of the land, or kind of become the new form of natives, which if you read Tuck and Yang is a settler move to innocence. And then there's also a K. Wayne Yang article just by themselves titled Ghetto Land Pedagogy that talks specifically about this kind of paradox. Then the second argument is kind of how there's been historical empirical examples of excluding indigenous people and kicking them out in order to rewild or conserve nature. So for example, Yosemite kicking out Miwoks, as well as a K-trick argument that I think would be strategic that says you cannot solve climate change without indigenous groups. So it would take out policy Fs that try to stop climate change in certain ways, but only use the government, because you could say only by using indigenous knowledge or practices can you actually solve climate change. Then when it comes to alternatives, I think that you can get away with lots of generic alternatives like decolonization, resistance, etc. But there's also lots of literature on specific alternatives to rewilding that can center things like indigenous voices. The next critique is the capitalism critique. I think that this would apply to AFs that kind of talk about ecotourism, try to increase the productivity of land like agriculture AFs, etc. And kind of a similar K-check argument that says you cannot solve climate change within a capitalist system. So obviously a good alternative would probably just be join the Communist Party or generic AFs like that, alts like that. And then there's an anti-blackness critique. So there's lots of literature on why conservation is kind of anti-black and racist. So there's a form of racial leakage that's a disad to the AF, and it's similar to the offshoring argument that says when you rewild in certain places, the production losses from rewilding that area will just lead to more pollution and other forms of extraction in lands that are majority black. So when it comes to disadvantages, I think there are a couple of disadvantages that can either be read as off-case positions or on-case turns. So first is the agriculture disad. The uniqueness would say that agriculture is good right now. And then the link says rewilding decreases agricultural productivity because it kicks farmers off their land in order to rewild. And that means the internal link is decreasing agricultural productivity causes food insecurity, and then food insecurity causes extinction. I think the best way to tackle this when you're affirmative is to take out the uniqueness. The shutdown right now definitely means the agriculture sector is not doing good right now, as well as kind of the link can be definitely turned because there's literature, i.e. Anthropocene rewilding, on how we can keep farms productive and also still rewild the land. And ecosystem resilience can actually increase agricultural production by making the soil more fertile and more beneficial to agriculture writ large. Then there's a politics disad. So uniqueness would talk about how there's talks about SNAP and healthcare happening now, or basically talks about kind of any important issue right now. And then the link is that rewilding is unpopular amongst the GOP or Republicans. And so the Republicans will stop conversations about SNAP or whatever your uniqueness talks about. And the impact is kind of cutting SNAP and healthcare leads to extinction via food insecurity, pandemics, etc. So I think the good thing about this decide is that you can change it to kind of do multiple different things as long as the link kind of stays the same about why rewilding is unpopular amongst Republicans. And then you need good internal links and uniqueness that talks about specific issues that you want to talk about. Then there's a leakage disad, which I was kind of talking about above with the anti-blackness critique. So the uniqueness would talk about how domestic production is high right now. And then the link says rewilding leads to offshore production because production losses when you rewild in other lands just means that you would move to produce in other countries where there isn't rewilding. And the internal link would say that offshore production leads to the US losing its trade hegemony or power or anything like that. Or you could also say it leads to economic losses and that causes extinction. So then when it comes to counterplans, I think that there's not really any specific counterplans that would solve the AF on this topic that don't link to disads. So I think that there's just going to be lots of generic counterplans that are read. So for example, a state's counterplan with a net benefit that states are kind of implementing environmental policy, which avoids politics disad. And then a sunset's counterplan, kind of imposing a sunset on the plan. And then the net benefit is that sunsets revitalize rule of law, but avoids the agriculture and leakage disad because we can stop the plan if it causes negative effects. And then a signing statements counterplan that talks about just a generic signing statements counterplan that's just specific to rewilding. But yeah, I don't think that there's going to be many specific counterplans on this topic unless they're in response to specific affirmatives. Then lastly, when it comes to philosophical arguments, I think that there's three main kind of things here. So first, of course, is probably a constancy that rewilding prioritizes nature over rational beings, and that fails the categorical imperative to value practical reason and undermines humanity. This would probably be a turn to anthro or a Kantese for obvious reasons. And then there's Heidegger NC that rewilding is kind of a form of covert technological control because we reframe nature to confer aesthetic values while still retaining control. I think that this would apply to apps that still try to have human intervention within the plan, and would say that kind of like the way that you plan and manage nature according to like in order to rewild still kind of is still according to human categories and values that lead to technological control and the impacts that Heidegger is talking about. And then there's a pragmatism NC that says rewilding confers to kind of abstract visions of purity, what it means to rewild, etc., that extend kind of beyond reality. And so the plan is a form of unrealistic moralism that disengages from human needs in favor of these unrealistic scenarios of rewilding. I think that the pragmatism NC isn't really strong in this topic because obviously probably just fiat the plan and then you'd have to debate solvency. But I think that there are some good reasons as to why pragmatism should be considered. So overall, that is the negative arguments for the rewilding topic. Feel free to have discussion in the comment section about other arguments that you would feel or that you would think would be strategic on this topic and talk with others, as well as email me or the debate hotline about specific resources that you think you would need in order to answer or in order to kind of create these arguments. So for example, I talked about some specific articles when it came to the settler colonialism critique. So feel free to just reach out to me. I'll put my email in the description and reach out and just let me know if you guys need any help finding articles, etc., or if you need any cards that answer specific arguments. But overall, that has been my topic analysis of the LD 2025 November-December rewilding topic. I'm Flynn Williams, and I'm with the debate hotline. And